r/MaliciousCompliance. First story. Landlord tries to keep security deposit. No, about 10 years ago, my at the time girlfriend, now wife, and I moved from the area we went to college to an apartment near where we planned to start our careers. I say it was an apartment, but it was really the basement of a house that the landlord had walled off to create 2 apartments to rent. The place was kinda crappy, but the rent was cheap for the area, and we were close to work. Everything was fine for a few months, but the only parking for us was on the street out front. The couple that rented the upstairs apartment had rights to the garage and driveway. They paid more than we did. Suddenly my car got a couple BS tickets for parking on the street. I'm guessing some ass clown cop needed to meet their quota, and my girlfriend's car got sideswiped in a hit and run. This crap had to stop, so we emailed the landlord, her preferred form of communication, to ask if there's anywhere safe for us to park. She replies, "Park anywhere you want." We had noticed that our upstairs neighbors usually eschewed the driveway to park in the front yard. They were horribly lazy, so we figured that would be a good spot for us too. We parked in the front yard the rest of the year. We figured that would be the end of it. We finished our lease, left the place in better shape than we found it, and requested our $1,500 security deposit back. After a couple weeks, we got a check for $700. WTF. Since there was no explanation, we asked the landlord for one, and she replied that the deducted amount was to resod the lawn, claiming that parking on it had damaged it. Now, I was the one who cut the grass at this house while we stayed there, so I was well aware that the lawn was more weeds and bald spots than grass. Picture the African savanna in midsummer. No one had ever lifted a finger to landscape any part of the property, but the landlord wanted to sell the house once the leases were up, and she figured she could get the renters to pay for a nice, new lawn. I complained to the landlord, didn't care. I put in a complaint with the local housing department, didn't care. I threatened to take her to court, didn't care. So, that's what I did, took her to small claims court. I had never sued anyone before, so I was going in prepared. I took pictures of the entire front yard. The area that we damaged was actually one of the best patches of grass, though it did have a small rut that my tires made when the yard was muddy in the summer. I got testimonials from our upstairs and across the street neighbors. Most importantly, I printed out the email where the landlord told us to park anywhere. We were suing for $1,800 to cover court costs and us both missing a day of work on top of the full security deposit. In mediation we said we would settle for $1,400, but she must have thought she was in the right because she refused to offer a penny more than the original $700 check, which we never cashed. When we got in front of the judge, it was pretty clear that she had no evidence, hadn't prepared anything, and just assumed that us kids would fall on our faces. We did not. We put everything we had in front of the judge and made our claim. He was impressed. He stopped us when we showed him the email to ask the landlord, "Did you really tell them to park wherever they wanted?" When she said yes, the judge replied, "Then what are we even talking about?" And that was that. Judgment in full for us, and that bitch had to pay to resod her own damn lawn. Next time you tell someone to park wherever you want, you'd better mean it. Or at least don't try to fuck someone over when they comply with what you said. If you made it this far, thanks for reading. Second story. You won't heed my warning about a shift not being covered over the weekend? Have a nice weekend. First time poster here, and my story happened about 10 years ago. TL. Doctor at the end. I work in an office, and, at the time, I was the new guy who only worked part-time, taking shifts here and there when needed. I could do pretty much anything, and did it well, but often had to ask around for extra shifts to make ends meet. One day, our supervisor went on short-term disability leave after an accident, and an assistant, let's call her Brenda, took over the job, which included the scheduling duties. Brenda was easily overwhelmed, and we believe that she was too proud to admit that she needed help. She had to plan the schedule for 5 teams, and I'd often tell her that I'd be available for more shifts to cover X or Y, as the slots were clearly empty. She was always pretty dismissive, and most times I'd end up not working more. People tried to work around her mishaps, so there was never any direct impact on the overall production. One time, I noticed that a lone position on the weekend that nobody wants to do when that person lady was 6/away was not being backfilled, even though it was essential to have someone in that chair. Hoping for extra shifts, I sent Brenda a casual email to bring to her attention the fact that the shift was not filled and if she had plans for that yet. Her response was an extra long email on work ethics and respect for my colleagues' time, that I'm new here and I should learn my place, to stop begging for extra shifts all the time, and that she had nothing else for me that week. Duly noted, ma'am. QMC, my last day at the office that week was Wednesday, and I knew that the shift had still not been filled. When I left, I wished everyone a nice weekend, including Brenda. See you next week. It's important to mention that I was on call. They couldn't just put me on the schedule and expect me to show up. They'd have to confirm with me beforehand. I got many calls on Saturday, about 30 minutes after the beginning of that shift, that was not being covered, asking where I was, why I wasn't in, that error alerts were being sent all over the country because nobody was there to do the job. I told the weekend manager that I was out of town as I wasn't on the schedule when I left on Wednesday. They'd need to take it up with Brenda. Monday morning, I was called in a senior manager's office. I was told that they were giving me a written warning because I didn't show up to work that weekend and it caused a lot of trouble for other managers. I pulled the email thread and was able to prove that I warned Brenda that a shift was not being filled, that I would be available if needed, but that Brenda made it clear she didn't need me. They then checked the log to see when the schedule was last changed, and yup, Friday afternoon, long after I was gone. I made it clear that she made no attempt to try to contact me. The senior manager apologized, and I was able to return to work. I don't believe Brenda was specifically punished, as we are all allowed mistakes. It happens, but she was eventually demoted. She retired probably a year after the incident. I ended up being promoted to full-time shortly after, and as it turns out, 10 years later, I'm now office supervisor, doing a much better job at managing schedules. TL, Dr. A supervisor dismissed my warning that an essential shift on the weekend was not being covered and scolded me for always begging for more shifts. I stopped asking, left for the weekend and let them deal with the shit show that would inevitably happen. And happen it did. Third story. Drop everything when you call. Got it. Back in March, my company furloughed a large amount of people, only keeping the bare minimum of essential people that I happened to be considered. One of the rudest and most obnoxious people there was thankfully furloughed. So over the last 5 months, things have been great, but 2 weeks ago she came back and has been her usual horrible self. I work for a publishing company as an accountant. I rarely deal with any of the other employees that aren't the publishers, customers, or the other accountants. There is one sales representative. We will call her Mary. 2 weeks ago, as Mary was beginning her work again, she had made a call to me stating that she needed her access to our servers again, and I told her I'd get to it within the next hour, to which she replied, "I've been here for 16 years. I run this company, it doesn't work without me here, so you'll do it, and you'll do it now." Well, we did just fine for almost 6 months without you, but who am I to argue with stupid people? She gets her access to the office drives first, scanners, printers, nothing special, and decides it's her turn to send an email to the owner of our company saying that I was disrespectful and wouldn't do anything for her, so he needed to put me in my place. Sure enough, Mary got her wish, and I was told to drop everything I was doing to do what she needs, no matter what I've got going on. We are still working from home, but as one of the accountants I have access to our office building and get asked to take care of some stupid things such as mailing our prints to the printing company, and yesterday, Mary was there. I go around and pick up all the pages to be printed, put them in order, and get them ready to package, and Mary comes along screaming how I didn't call a customer she demanded I call, an email I hadn't even seen, because I was collecting prints. The owner of the company, being in his office, hears her screaming and decides to share that he did inform me to drop whatever I was doing to help her catch up on her daily activities. Me, already annoyed with the masks, "You're sure you want me to drop what I'm doing and call her customer right now?" and with a nod and turn to go back to his office, I drop the official prints on the ground and they scatter across the floor, bending and crumpling the papers, makes the printers angry when they're not perfect, and walk away to the phone. Mary screams and yells at the owner, who turns around and laughs and says he didn't mean literally, but since I was doing what Mary was supposed to be doing, she could stay and fix my mess. She ended up staying 5 hours past our regular closing time, reprinting and redoing the magazine order to get out in time for publishing. The accounting team was so proud someone finally did something, and she refuses to talk to any of us anymore. Thankfully, best news ever. Fourth story. Owner's sister told me to leave, so I did. This happened ages ago, but it's definitely one of the most satisfying ways I've left a job. After high school, I had a 6-month gap before starting college. The timing just happened to work out that way. I got a full-time job at an Italian family bakery / coffee bar, doing typical front of the house FOP stuff, making real espressos and cappuccinos, ringing up customers, taking orders, etc. There were about 6 FOP employees, but since I was the only one over 18 and out of high school, I was given the opening shift, usually being the only one in the front for the first few slow hours, with just a few bakers in the back. My bosses, a married couple, were not very present. The husband would rarely show up, and the wife wasn't much better. The husband's single childless 60-ish-year-old sister, Sylvia, would roll in around 10 AM most days and work, but mostly just tell me what needed to be done. We got along great at first, but everyone knew I was headed off to college in a few months and wouldn't be stuck in the same place for the rest of my life, like she was. Sylvia started getting very snippy and sarcastic with me and would read me the riot act if I didn't do something exactly the way she wanted. I couldn't do anything to her satisfaction and she criticized everything I did. Even though we pretty much had the same job descriptions and she was never specified as my official manager, she acted like she was the owner whenever her brother wasn't around. The owner's teenage son would put on the same airs when he sporadically worked there. It was mostly when he wanted them to buy him something outrageous and they made him earn it. Their entitled behavior knew no bounds and stopped just short of pocketing money directly from the register. If you need a frame of reference, the last straw was when I was taking an order for a dozen French rolls. For those of you who don't know, French bread is only made with flour, water, salt and yeast. Ours came out shaped kind of like footballs and Sylvia insisted on calling them football rolls, even though they weren't called that on our menu. I didn't call them that because the first few times I did, the customers then asked what kind of bread it was. When I called it a French roll, they knew what kind of bread they were getting. So, I took the order and go into the kitchen to give them their copy. This is back when we used carbon copies. I came back out to the front and Sylvia proceeded to lecture me on how they're football rolls not French rolls, and how I'll confuse the Hispanic workers because they don't know English very well. When she'd finished her rant, I told her they've understood the orders perfectly the whole time I've worked here. And they're French rolls because they're made of French bread, like it says on the menu. She continued to berate me for insubordination and ended with an ultimatum: either I call them football rolls or just leave. So I left. It seems like a stupid hill to die on, but dealing with her attitude was making me miserable, and I couldn't resist the out she gave me. I called the wife and explained to her what happened and why I wouldn't be back. She accepted it with a resigned "sorry to see you go, you're not the first, and you won't be the last one who leaves this way" attitude. I got a job at a Barnes & Noble for a few months. The employee discount at Christmas was serendipity, and left for school. Last I heard, they were closed, but had sold the bakery name, so some random bakery 5 towns over has the same name.